Hi, we're the Wynns. I'm Eddie.
And I'm Kendel.
We have been going to Radiant Life Church for about 3 years. We live in Missouri City.
We've been married for 13 years.
13 years. And we're happily married now.
So we met New Year's Eve, and we got engaged in May and married in October. So we had kind of a whirlwind romance. And we came from two completely different backgrounds. I grew up in a very happy home. The main thing I remember about my childhood is laughter.
I remember anger, mostly.
So it was a big adjustment, and we had a lot of fighting. And when I say fighting, I don't mean like the cute little arguments people have.
We do that now.
Yeah, but it was screaming at each other. It was just, if you didn't know us, you would think we hated each other. It got to the point where we couldn't even be in the same room without having yelling matches and saying mean things to each other. And for probably the first year, we hid that from people. We painted a happy face on things.
That's what Christians do.
Yeah, and we just didn't want anyone to know the struggles we were having. But probably the last month before the biggest blowout, we got to where we just didn't even care if we were in public, if people were in front of us. We just fought constantly. And there was just a breaking point for us. And we had a friend over for dinner, and we started fighting, and it escalated, and there was yelling and screaming. And finally Eddie said, "I'm taking our friend home. And then after I do that, I'm coming home and packing my stuff, and that's it. This marriage is over." And so he loaded the friend in the car and took off, and I was left by myself, and it was completely devastating for me. I didn't really know how I felt about it. I knew I felt like a failure. We had been married a year. It should have been, the newlywed phase, the happiest time of our marriage, and it was just a struggle day by day. And so I had a lot of time crying and praying. He drove around for a long time. He was gone for several hours. And I just had to kind of be alone with myself and with my thoughts and just prayed. I didn't even know what to pray. I didn't know if I was happy he was moving out, if I was sad he was moving out. But I did feel like just a complete failure at that point.
So I was out driving. I was also miserable. I felt like a failure. I was praying. I pulled over and just spent time with God, and I didn't honestly think I was going to hear from God. We'd gotten to that point where, I was going through the motions, and I told God, I thought you had something better for me. I grew up in a terrible home. It was rough. I didn't want this for my family. So I was struggling with that. And I remember God actually speaking to me, and I saw this picture of Jesus, and he picked me up when I was my worst. He loved me when I was so unlovable. And I realized at that moment that love is not about the feelings you have when you are in love, or we talk about falling in love and falling out of love. That's not an option for a Christian. I didn't necessarily have the same feelings I had. I have them now, but I didn't have them at that point. I was like her. I didn't know if I was glad this was finally over, just to rip the Band-Aid off, or I didn't know what I wanted. And I realized that it doesn't matter what I want. I made a vow before God. We weren't gonna let this happen. And I remember God showing me this image of, you do it out of obedience. Love is not, the old adage, love is a verb. It is, truly. It's not about the feelings you feel when you're doing something. It's about doing something. I do what is right because it is right, not because I feel like doing it, not because those little fuzzy feelings are there, because this is what God expects me to do. So with that new knowledge, I drove home.
And so he came home, and at this point I was still a mess, and he just sat down with me and said, the word divorce is not on the table. I'm not leaving. And I remember clearly him saying to me, if we have to fight every single day for the rest of our lives to keep this marriage together, that's what we're going to do. It doesn't matter how hard it gets. It doesn't matter how ugly it gets. That's what we're going to do. And I remember having this sense of, that was a turning point for me, because outwardly things did not change right away. We still fought a lot, but it was different for me because I felt safe. I felt like we were fighting for our marriage instead of just fighting. And so inwardly, that moment changed for us. And we still fought. It probably took us 5 years to really get the hang of fighting fair, and
Wouldn't fight every day, but
right,
it
did
got
get
better and better.
over time. It did.
By
And
the 5th year, I think we finally got it figured out.
right, and we still have our off days, of course.
I don't.
Okay, I still have my off
That's
days,
true.
but we have our off days. But it's just different when you know that we're in this for the long haul, and you have that place that's safe, and you don't feel like if you mess up or you have those fights that somebody's going to walk out on you. So that's made a huge difference, at least for me.
So, we are now happily married. We made it through the rough times. I feel like marriage is truly the perfect example of what the Bible uses marriage as, like us married to Christ. It's because, we were broken when we first got married. Jesus restored that. I mean, we could have went down the path of divorce and failure and misery, and we chose to stick it out, and now I'm really happy about that. So, you?
Yes, I'm really happy about that too.
So, yeah, it's good.
And it's worth the struggle. It's worth
It is worth the
the
struggle.
hard work. And yes, 5 years sounds like a really long time, but we look back at that time now and it seems so far away. It was like a lifetime ago. And it was worth the struggle. It was worth just digging in your heels and doing what you have to do to keep it together.
Definitely. I also remember I was the first to say I love you, so
And I'll never ever live
kudos
that
to
down.
me.